Let's now look at the impact of domestic politics on Japanese foreign policy, starting from the first important point, and that is concerning Japanese foreign policy strategy during the Cold War, also known as the Yoshida Doctrine. So why is it called Yoshida Doctrine, and what was the meaning of the Yoshida Doctrine? What was the idea behind pursuing this strategy during the Cold War? The Yoshida Doctrine essentially is named after the former Prime Minister of Japan at the end of the 40s, early 50s, Yoshida Shigeru. Essentially, the Yoshida Doctrine meant that Japan would align itself with the United States, and that happened when Japan signed the 1951 Security Treaty with the United States. Japan would pursue minimal military rearmament and instead focus on economic and societal revival after the Second World War. Why and what ensured the continuity and sustainability of that strategy during the Cold War? The burden of history was one of the key factors. What I mean by burden of history is, of course, the history of Japan's imperial expansion in Asia at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, the following defeat in the war and occupation from 1945 until 1952 for 7 years. So the burden of history, the suffering that Japanese people had as a result of the Second World War, as a result of the bombings, as a result of the devastation, and also the suffering that Japan inflicted on other countries. So the narrative of the impact of the history played an important role in the decisions of Japanese decision makers in the early 50s to focus on reviving the society, to focus on pursuing non-military foreign policies, to use non-military instruments of power, and to pursue minimal military rearmament. So essentially, the Yoshida Doctrine meant that Japan would be rejecting military power and instead embark on and use peaceful means of foreign policy, in particular diplomatic and economic means. For example, Japan became the largest foreign aid provider to countries in Asia, and Japan became the country which was, during the Cold War, driving regional economic development and growth in Asia. This also meant that Japan came to be described as an economic giant and political pygmy. It was under the guidance of that doctrine that Japan focused solely on developing its economy. Japan developed its society, became the second largest economy, but Japan's role in international political, and in particular security missions, remained very, very limited, hence the reference economic giant, political pygmy. The Yoshida Doctrine was also linked and had a strong driver for this approach to foreign policy was the domestic anti-militarism in Japan, which was institutionalized in the Japanese constitution and manifested through the Article 9, also known as the Peace Clause, Japanese constitution, which was promulgated in 1947. So in the first paragraph of Article 9, Japan renounces war as a sovereign right of the nation and threat or use of force as a means of settling international disputes. And in the second paragraph, Japan essentially commits itself to not possess land, sea, and air forces in order to accomplish the aim of the preceding paragraph. In other words, that Japan will not be using forces for the purpose of settling international disputes. Anti-militarism and pacifism was very strong in Japan, in post-war Japan, and does remain strong now in 21st century Japan. In particular, if we look at most opinion polls, Japanese people are against, majority of Japanese people remain against revision of Article 9. And Article 9 so far has not been revised, even though the strongest proponents of Article 9 division have been, for example, former Prime Minister Abe and also members of his ruling LDP party. How Article 9 is interpreted? It permits a minimum level of military force necessary for individual and national self-defense, but until 2014, it prohibited Japan's participation in collective self-defense arrangements. Japan, as every member of the United Nations, as a member nation of the United Nations, under Article 51 of the UN Charter, has a right to exercise collective self-defense, which Japan chose not to until 2014. And in 2014, Prime Minister Abe reinterpreted Article 9, allowing Japan to exercise its right to collective self-defense under three conditions. The first one being that Japan's security had to be threatened. And secondly, that there would be no other means for Japan to respond to a particular threat, but exercising collective self-defense. And the force should be used to the minimum possible level. Essentially, the focus remains on the condition that there should be a direct threat to Japan's security in order to defend an ally. Japan's international security role is not unconstitutional so long as it does not involve the use of military force, or essentially so long as Japan's self-defense forces do not participate in combat operations. The US-Japan alliance during the Cold War, how it evolved. In 1960, the US-Japan Security Treaty was revised and established specific asymmetrical arrangements in place. This has not changed, and the 21st century US-Japan alliance still is based on the Security Treaty of 1960. What do these asymmetrical arrangements mean? Under Article 5, the US provides for Japan's defense. Under Article 6, Japan is committed to providing bases and host nation support to the US military. As we see from this slide, there is no reciprocal commitment on the part of Japan to defend the United States under Article 6. And the fact that, for example, collective self-defense now is allowed to Japan, it has strong limitations, as I mentioned. That's one. And second, having that right to exercise collective self-defense doesn't mean that political leaders will decide to choose to exercise that right. And as we see, the Security Treaty still remains very much asymmetrical in terms of the mutuality of defending an ally. The United States is committed to Japan's defense. Japan is not committed. During the Cold War, there were a number of national security concepts and principles which were adopted by successive Japanese administrations in line with the limitations of the Article 9, and also they were in line with the arrangements, US-Japan security arrangement based on the Security Treaty. The purpose of this concept and principles was to limit Japan's security role, to limit the role of the self-defense forces. For example, the main principle was exclusively defense-oriented policy, which remains until the present day, that Japan is pursuing exclusively defense-oriented policy. Civilian control of the military was also an important principle during the Cold War. Japan also adopted the three non-nuclear principles, which have not changed until today, until the 21st century Japan, not to possess, produce, or introduce nuclear weapons to Japan. There was also, in the mid-1970s, another important principle. 1% of GDP was allowed to be spent on defense spending. In other words, there was a cap of 1% of GDP. And finally, there was important concept adopted also during the Cold War years, the concept of comprehensive security. In other words, that Japan's conceptualization of security was a broad one. It included both um, military aspects, but primarily non-military, economic, political, societal security, environmental security. So looking at those principles, the objective was to focus on pursuing diplomatic and economic tools in Japan's foreign policy to achieve Japan's foreign policy objectives, to limit the role of the South Japan forces and to limit the military security role of Japan.